Well, I am thrilled to be here, not only because I can't think of a more auspicious and exciting event than Briany Days, but also because FAU is my alma mater. And so it's really an honor to be here. Thank you to Palm Health and to Dr. Perry and to my hosts. We're going to be talking today about the neuroscience and experience of addiction, but I guess I could say that another title could be to explain to you why I think we're so stuck with addiction. It's a tremendous burden for the whole world and for many individuals and families as well as communities. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. How did we get so stuck? But I wanted to begin by first trying to describe what addiction is. And this is important and unfortunately not all that straightforward. The National Institutes of Health and the American Medical Association are kind of always revising their view of addiction. But I kind of like to start with the ancient Romans who developed this word, addictio, to describe what happened when you owed a debt to somebody that you couldn't pay. So when you were indebted, the practice was to make you a slave of the person you owed the money to. And you remained the slave until you could pay it back. And so people, would spend their lives like this. We don't do this anymore. But for that reason, I think you could say that addiction is what happens when the debt from borrowing good feelings from the future comes due. I think that substance use disorders are, as I said, really devastating. About 10,000 people, more than 10,000 people die every single day around the globe from excessive use of mind-altering chemicals. It's the leading cause of death among people between ages 15 and 34. So it's a big problem. And compared to the general population, if you have an alcohol use disorder, you die about 5 times earlier. If you have an opiate use disorder, about 15 times earlier. So these are mental illnesses that damage us. And another definition, I guess my other short version of addiction, is that it's what happens when the costs of using outweigh the benefits, but you don't stop. So it's irrational for that reason. So it's a psychological disorder and a mental disorder, and it usually begins with experimentation in adolescence. It's common to try new things and to go out on a limb a little bit, especially when we're younger. But sometimes that develops into a habit. With regular use, the brain adapts, and so that habit becomes a means of coping with all kinds of things, stress, anxiety, boredom. And coping is just kind of one step away from compulsion. So as this trajectory unfolds, you can see that you're sort of losing choice and moving more and more toward compulsive behavior. At that point or shortly after, when you don't have the drug on board, you're in a state of withdrawal, which means that you feel less well than you would have felt if you weren't addicted. So in the beginning, with experimentation, taking an addictive substance makes you kind of boost reality. But by this point, you're just trying to maintain reality without feeling miserable. And then, I guess, one more step to despair. And as I said, this happens for lots of people. It's always the result of changes in the brain that lead to tolerance and dependence and craving. So those are kind of the hallmarks of addiction. Tolerance is what happens when you need more and more of a drug to feel the same effect, or if you take the same amount, then it works less and less well. That's due to the brain adapting. Dependence is what happens when you take the drug away and then you feel withdrawal. So, not quite as good as normal. And then those two things kind of drive craving. So if you're tolerant and dependent, then you're focused a lot on getting drugs. So these are chronic, progressive, lifelong diseases. There's no cure. And overall, killing lots of people, and on the way destroying families and all kinds of things. So this is kind of all bad news, but I do want to point out, and my story is testament to this, that you can go back up. There's no evidence you can probably go back, or not good evidence that you can go back to the pleasure experimentation phase. But if you end up with a substance use disorder, which is due to the brain adapting to regular use of mind-altering chemicals, the brain can continue to adapt and kind of lead you out of that. So hopefully that quick tour gives you an idea of what we're talking about. But to explain how it happens, I'm going to start way back. I am also work at a liberal arts college, so my heart is in the liberal arts, and I'm going to start with a story that probably many of you know about Socrates. So he was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and failing to endorse the state gods. He had been imprisoned, and he was set to come up and drink the hemlock, but he was permitted to give one last lesson to his students, or one last discourse. His students were there, including Plato, his most famous student, who wrote down everything Socrates said. But before he started his lecture, as he came up out of the cellar in chains, they took his shackles off, and he just, on a side note, such a brilliant thinker, commented that, wow, how odd this is. I know I'm going to die, but I feel great because I had the shackles on, and now they're off. And isn't it the case that whenever you feel pain, you're compelled to feel pleasure as it goes away? Or the intonation or the inference is that if you feel pleasure, you're kind of compelled to feel pain. So this idea that gave rise, maybe 2,000 years later or so, to a concept of homeostasis, which we're going to get to, is that the nervous system, and maybe all the world, I guess, this is thermodynamics too, if you're coming from a physics, aren't we in a physics building? No, maybe not. It's tomorrow. So anyway, if you have one extreme, you go to the other. So, energy is kind of transformed in a yin and a yang kind of balance. So pain leads to pleasure, pleasure leads to pain. And this was kind of uncovered by a physiologist in France, Claude Bernard, who was studying things like body temperature and heart rate and glucose levels. And what he realized is that these are all body functions that are maintained in a kind of a stable internal state. And he commented, I think so astutely, that this milieu intérieur, which I'm not great at French, but is a condition for a free and independent life, having this stable state. If you don't have it, for instance, like you're a snake, you don't have a free and independent life because your activity is regulated by the environment. But because we can carry around a stable environment with us, our nervous system can adapt, we are able to go outside in the cold or in the heat and still be ourselves. So this idea was picked up by another physiologist. I'm getting to the end of the history lesson soon, but in the US, at Harvard actually, Walter Cannon, who used those ideas of Bernard to make the term homeostasis. And you probably have heard of Walter Cannon because he also is the guy who coined the term fight or flight. So he was a pretty pithy scientist. And he wrote a book where he talked about homeostasis called The Wisdom of the Body. Again, arguing that in order to be free, basically, we have to be stable inside. And this happens with our body temperature. As I said, it happens with sleep drive. It happens with all kinds of aspects of physiology, but it happens to you and me all the time too. So imagine, if you will, that you find a lump somewhere and you're concerned it could be cancer. So your homeostasis level is kind of disrupted because you're now, whereas you had felt kind of okay, now you're anxious and upset, worried, and it's going to take a while to get into a doctor and get a biopsy. But let's say all that unfolds while you're kind of disrupted. After you find out that the mass is benign, do you think you'd go right back to normal? No, you probably would be relieved and grateful and feel that way for days, is my guess. But it works the other way too. And my example is going to be when I get back to Pennsylvania on Wednesday morning. So I've been in gorgeous sunny Florida, and I'm going to get home after my vacation, and I bet that, you know, the kitchen counter and my desk and my email are going to make me feel less well than I did before I left. It's the payoff, or the payback, I guess, for having a nice time. But the most simple example, I think, is one many of us experienced, falling in love. Isn't it the case that initially your sweetie pie is the best thing in the world, all you need, really? And in fact, if we look at the brain scans of people in this early stage of falling in love, when their homeostasis is disrupted, it looks a lot like the brain scans of people on cocaine. So it's kind of that feeling. You don't need food, you don't need sleep, you don't need anything else, just your sweetie. But then you get used to them, don't you? So it kind of levels out after a while. Everything is fine. We would say you're tolerant. And then you lose them. And it goes the other way, doesn't it? Even though, you know, they weren't really that great anymore, but it was better than nothing. So, okay, I can see you relate. So this happens all the time, all over the place. And this really should remind you of Socrates. One extreme feeling produces the other. Always, every time. And so why does the nervous system work this way? Why not just go from elated to back to normal? Why do we have to go from elated to sad? So when I wrote my book, this I got really into as a basic scientist, and I wrote like 3 chapters on this, and my editor was pulling her hair out. She's not a scientist. She said, no one wants to, they're not going to read through this. So I have distilled 3 chapters down into 1 slide. And here's my story about it, which we can talk about later if you would like. But let's pretend this is the nervous system. It acts by electrical chemical signals, and those are kind of pretty dynamic. They're moving all over the place. Now let's say something really important happens, whatever that is. And there's that signal. And it's in yellow, so you can kind of pick it up. But how much easier would it be to pick up that signal if the nervous system was maintained in a stable way? So the reason we have that is because we cannot detect meaningful stimuli very well if our nervous system is up and down, kind of like a snake's body temperature. Instead, meaningful stimuli, which are, by the way, meaningful because they're going to help us survive, either get good things or avoid bad things, are really evident in the context of a stable nervous system. So just like we maintain body temperature and sleep drives, we maintain our affect, our feeling states. And that insight really came from 2 guys at the University of Pennsylvania in the 70s, so this is old, who took the ideas of Bernard and Walter Cannon, and really originally Socrates and probably lots of other wise people around the globe, to apply it to our psychological states. And they said that strong feelings always elicit the opposite feeling. And they pointed out that one way to produce strong feelings is to take addictive drugs. So I have a few kind of slides to describe what happens, and then we're going to go through that. It's a little hairy maybe, but it's so important. They had this insight that I think it really drives much of the research on the neuroscience of substance use disorders today. This was 50 years ago, more than 50. So they said we all have a baseline neutral state, which is the line in the middle, the neutral feeling, and that when you have a drug, an addictive drug on the brain, what happens is you get a big rush. And it doesn't matter if that drug is nicotine or alcohol or Coke or whatever it is, you're going to elicit a positive feeling, which is why we take the drugs to begin with, and we'll get to that in a minute. That feeling fades pretty quick, the initial rush, and then it's stable, kind of like you still got the boyfriend, you know, it's good, but it's not quite as great over time. And as long as the drug is there, maybe you are pretty good, but after it goes away, there's always a rebound, always a rebound. And it's not so big. This is the first time you take it, so you can see that you're below neutral. That could be a hangover. It could be jonesing. It could be, you know, not being able to wake up without your caffeine or whatever. You know, you always have the opposite state. Now, what happens, we know, is that if this was all it was, it wouldn't be that bad, because just doing the cost-benefit analysis, you can see, wow, you're winning here, right? The rebound isn't that bad. But the brain, because it can, it adapts, really with an intention, again, to maintain neutrality, so that over time, what happens is you get barely a bump. The drug makes you feel normal, but the rebound is tremendous. This is tolerance. This is withdrawal. And you can see why you would crave the drug, because without it, you're less well than normal. So they described that, and that's my picture. I'm going to start again with the graphs from the original paper in 1974, just so I can make sure if you leave early, at least you'll get this, because this is kind of the heart of addiction research. So our first few stimulations, we have an experience like that. We go from a zero or a neutral feeling state to a positive state, and then dip down. That happens, they said, and this is the key part, because of two processes underlying it. The first process is the A process, and that is what the drug does to the body. So it might be that it's releasing dopamine in a circuit, or it's binding to cannabinoid receptors, or releasing GABA, or whatever it is. It's all the neurochemistry or the neurochemical interactions of the drug on the brain. The B process is the brain's response to what the drug does to the brain. So the A process is caused by the drug. The B process is what the brain does to what's caused by the drug. And when you add those two together, you get this. So because the brain is so clever, it doesn't just stop there, right? It can change, and it does. The brain's best attribute, as far as I'm concerned, is its ability to adapt. It's responsible for all our glory, I think. So the brain adapts, the B process gets bigger, and it comes on earlier, and it lasts longer. So now the net effect is really to keep you at that neutral state so that you can tell if something meaningful happens. It's great for your survival, but it's the bane of every drug addict and alcoholic, because they really can't, with repeated use, get the good feelings again. It's always that the first time is the best time. The brain not only comes on earlier, lasts longer, and stays longer, but it learns to anticipate the drugs are coming. So, for instance, the paraphernalia that's associated with getting high elicits a B process, just like the bell elicited salivation in Pavlov's dogs. It predicts that the drug is coming. So the brain doesn't have to wait. It's not no dope, right? It starts right away, making the opponent process. It could be the people you use with. It could be the time of day or the time of week. If you drink every Friday, mark my words, on Fridays you'll be tense and anxious until you get your drink, because alcohol is a sedative, and the opposite of that, the brain produces, so that now when you get the alcohol, you're just right. It could be the places you go. I'm a big fan of live music. You know, I think it's associated with using for lots of people. It could be feeling states. People who use regularly, like I did, and I'll get to that in just a minute here, you know, anytime they feel sad or relieved or bored, you know, that's a cue to pick up something, so titrate their feelings. So those things then bring on the B state. It could be a wad of cash, you know, payday. And all of this by itself then brings on this B process. So imagine any of those cues without the drug. This is what your brain does. It's ready so that when the drug comes, you never leave, which means that you're craving. The only way to fix this, that, you know, the obvious way to fix it, probably I should say in the most direct way, is to just take the drug, feel better. And in fact, I'd say there's three main causes of relapse. The first one is the cues associated with the drug, like I just showed you. All of those things tell the brain the drug is coming. The brain doesn't need to wait. It puts on the counteracting or compensatory B process. Also a taste of drug, and I didn't skip the article here. All drugs share a common substrate, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And so any drug can sort of grease the rails for any other one. You know, people will be trying to quit smoking, and they'll go out and have a drink at the bar, and the next thing you know, they think, just one cigarette won't kill me, or vice versa. And then stress, and a lot of my research is about the relationship between stress and craving, but you know, stress affects everything, so it's kind of hard to know where to start here, but it's definitely a major cause of relapse. So lots of people use drugs, and not everybody has a problem. So I just want to say that about 20% of users, and this is true for cannabis users and alcoholics and even other drugs that seem like they're really dangerous, about 20% develop a problem. And we want to know why are those 20% those 20%? In general, we know that regular use will lead to addiction. So that is to say, anybody could develop a substance use disorder, but some people are definitely more prone than others. And this was kind of the topic for me in most of my research. I'm really interested in what's different about the brains of people who go on to develop a problem before they ever start. And I'm going to summarize that in 3 ways. And this is really the subtitle of this slide is It's Complicated. But genetics have a big role, the environment has a big role, and development has a big role. So we've known for a long time that addiction runs in families. I developed a substance use disorder during my teens, and I kind of hit bottom by the time I was 23, which I'll share a little more about later. But I didn't have a lot of people with substance use disorders in my family, but there were a few. And I think it's such a pervasive illness, if there's 20%, that most of us have a few. But in general, about half the risk is due to inherited factors. So it tends to run in families, and we don't know what those inherited factors are. I thought when I started research, we'll just pick out the genes that are critical and then kind of fix their activity. But it turns out there are probably hundreds of genes involved, and they each have a tiny effect. So, and they're having indirect effects through things like novelty seeking, if you have a strong tendency to like new things, or risk-taking, which these are biologically driven or constrained tendencies, traits, psychologists would call them. Being really sensitive to reward and insensitive to punishment. These kind of 4 personality tendencies really increase the likelihood of developing a problem. But there's lots. So, and we're studying them all the time, and it's like looking for a piece of hay in a hay field, as opposed to a needle in a haystack, which would be relatively easy. Environment has a big role, but again, these factors are so pervasive. So our culture is one that really endorses using chemicals to change the way we feel and the way we experience the world. So almost all of us have access, no matter where you are in the world. Our peers have a big influence, especially during adolescence. Stress and trauma are very big factors too. And especially early. I told you that stress was one of the things that caused relapse, but it also increases the tendency to pick up a drug and to appreciate the drug. So prenatal exposure and other, especially adverse childhood experiences, which is to say, stressors during childhood. Turns out that stress is bad for all of us, but it's more bad for some than others. And while you're developing as a kid, stress is particularly hard because it's really inescapable usually. And it kind of sets you up to be, to look for ways of coping. And when you get the opportunity to use a drug as an adolescent, which is when most of us get the opportunity, then that is really seen as an advantage to helping cope, especially if you've been stressed. So this is to say, if you have some genetic liability and you have the environment that most of us have involving stressors and opportunity, and you have adolescent exposure, then you've kind of got the perfect recipe. And more people have the perfect recipe, I guess. So let me leave it at that for right now. I'm going to focus a little bit on adolescent exposure, so I want you to especially keep that in mind. But before I get to that, I just wanted to do one more little introductory point, which is to say that even though I've talked about addiction as pathological, and it definitely is pathological, causing lots of suffering and loss of life, using drugs is totally normal. So it turns out we're wired, we are made to appreciate mind-altering chemicals. People have been using chemicals to change their thoughts and feelings and behaviors since before there were people. So Neanderthals used chemicals, our ancestors. It just seems that every single culture that did, which is virtually all of us, because, for instance, alcohol naturally happens when rotting fruit gets around air, So there was opportunity, and we have taken it. Also, other animals do it, which is a good indication that, it's not some quirk of humanity, as most things aren't. It's really a quirk of biology that we just are set up to appreciate this kind of pharmacological escape. And the reason for that, in a way, is at least centered on the role of these dopamine reward pathways. So here's my picture of the brain, my little token picture. The red spots are the spots that involve dopamine, the neurotransmitter that everybody's heard of. There's not a lot of dopamine in the brain, and you might not appreciate that, but if I had put serotonin pathways, let's say, or acetylcholine or norepinephrine pathways, there would be much more blanked out. There's really just two main pathways for dopamine, and one of them, the one on the top with the 3 hours going up, that has to do with movement. And the one on the lower spot coming up to the cortex in the front of the brain has to do with pleasure. And it's really more than pleasure. It's really something tantalizing, something interesting, something intriguing, something newsworthy. Whenever something kind of cool comes across us, and it could be cool in a good or bad way, by the way. It could be cool, like a potential mate, or it could be, a lack of oxygen. Either way, dopamine goes wild, and then isn't it interesting or cool that then we move toward or away? So that's what dopamine is about. It's kind of orienting us to what's important and then helping us to get to it or not. So this evolved through natural selection. Good news, right? We want to know what's important. That's a big function of the brain. And it promotes eating and sex. So those are tantalizing, aren't they? Chocolate cake and foreplay. This is like sort of the definition. And dopamine is released in these areas to help us enjoy food and sex. Because if we don't enjoy food and sex, then it's not really good for the survival of the species, is it? But every single addictive drug co-opts that pathway. So it kind of substitutes for meaningful stimuli in the environment, and we can get as much as we want, right? We can buy it in big bottles and distill it, or in big bags, or shoot it right into our veins. So, chocolate is good, but not that good. The thing about this pathway, so this is sort of the shared neurobiology of all addictive substances, but it gets less sensitive the more you use it. Just as, and I'm going to talk about that, but this is a pathway that was sort of meant for subtle things, like your sweetie pie holds your hand, or you have a delicious soup or something, not like big bags of, rocks or something. So what happens is with these kind of potent stimuli, it's almost like listening to music too loud. At first it sounds really good, but then eventually you're deaf. And so that deafening is a kind of a B process where now you need the drug to have any pleasure. So I said that early use was a problem, adolescent exposure, and we're going to kind of focus on that. So we have, I don't know what the latest counts are, but I do know that probably a year ago it was shown, or maybe a little less, that 1 in 4 kids is depressed, 1 in 5 is anxious. This is people under 18. And substance use is going up as well. So in hand, those kind of go together. And we know that about 1 in 5 people, 1 in 5 of us, as I said, 20%, have a substance use disorder. Many people have more than one, so they're drinking too much and they're also using other things a lot. Most people, some estimates are 9 out of 10 people who develop a problem begin using before they're 18. It's massively a developmental problem. So for instance, 1/4 of people who first get high on anything, alcohol or anything, before they're 18 develop a substance use disorder, while only 1 in 25 who wait till they're 21 develop a problem. This is an especially vulnerable period in development. And that is, if we really wanted to stop the problem, we'd have to take all the adolescents and ship them to the moon where there was nothing to use, for just this little period, then they could come back. Again, I said it before, it's the leading cause of death in young people. So for that reason, these reasons, some people have said that adolescent substance use is either the largest or one of the largest and most preventable public health problems in the world. So why do they use it? I mean, why? 70%, now more, I think, of kids who graduate high school have drunk alcohol. About half of them have used illicit drugs, although marijuana was included in that, and now it's not illicit everywhere, but so probably more than half, and more than half have tried nicotine. Again, they do that usually on a whim. About 1 in 5 have taken prescription drugs off label. And these are really critical numbers because this is such a big risk. This is how you train the brain to develop those changes that lead to tolerance and dependence and craving. So why do they do it? Well, kids are built to be novelty seeking. Are they satisfied with what is? No. They are built to be risk-taking. They are designed with low impulse control, and I'll show you how in a minute. And they're naturally insensitive to punishment. So I told you that those were factors in any of us that make it worse, but those are sort of the definition of adolescence. And this is for good reason. So I'm gonna describe the brain that leads to that, but then I'm gonna help, I think, or I'm gonna try to explain why we think this is. So there's basically a gap in brain development between limbic structures, so the subcortical structures that help us care about meaningful stimuli, find things that matter to us, the motivational and emotional substrates of the brain are fully online by the time you're 13. In fact, they're really strong, aren't they? Kids have plenty of feelings, strong feelings. I just had 3 teenagers. The last one just moved out to college, you know, and it's like, phew. But at the same time as they have this strong drive, these strong opinions and feelings, they don't really have the cortex to manage those. So there is this intentional gap. They can't control their impulses so well. They're not as capable of abstract reasoning. And this is helpful. This is a good thing, believe me, because if there wasn't a gap and they weren't risk-taking and impulsive a little bit and looking for new experiences, let's face it, they wouldn't leave the nest, right? They'd be just like old folks. Conservative, worried, oh, you know, this could happen, that could happen. And they're not built that way for themselves because this is the time in development. If you're taking developmental psychology, you might remember that the goal of this period is to find your identity. How do you find it? Well, maybe I like blue hair. Maybe I like boys. Maybe I like girls. Maybe I like, you know, skiing. I don't know. But they kind of go out on their own because they have those tendencies. And it's also great for the population because if everybody's conservative and worried about what could happen, then we wouldn't make progress as much. So everything's great until you throw widespread access to these powerful, mind-altering chemicals. So what risk can you take, you know, while you're working your job at the fast food restaurant and taking mind-numbing classes in high school, you know? I mean, there's not a lot around maybe for some people, so drugs are really there. And this was my story, I would say. I didn't have a lot of addiction in my family. I had some, but I was kind of a normal 7-year-old or 8-year-old here, you can see. I took my first drink when I was 13 on a whim, and I was at a girlfriend's house. I was just about 13, so it was pretty early. And she had this idea, you know, oh, let's go see what's in my parents' liquor stash in the basement. They had tons. We drank a gallon of wine. I'm sure I had more than my share because that was my tendency right from the start. So I drank more than a half a gallon of wine. Loved it. I don't know. I think I was a little prone to maybe anxiety and there was some stress at my house. Who knows? But I drank that wine and I felt like, aha. This is absolutely the solution to living. And I literally thought that this is how adults get through the world. I didn't even know that I was so incapable, but all the insecurities that I had went away, all the worries, all the I'm not enough. I drank the wine, my belly was warm, my brain was humming. I leaned out the window of her bedroom later thinking, I got it made. And I spent 13 years. This is me a few years later at a family gathering. So I was here 13 or 14. I was wasted in that picture at a family gathering. I used every chance I could get to find something. For the next 10 years, from 13 to 23, I never said no. And I thought, there were certain things I wasn't going to do, but that went out the window because I just really loved to escape myself, which is, I look back now and I think it's kind of understandable. It's hard to grow up. And I didn't have maybe ideal support in a way, although I had much better than many people. But anyway, for whatever reason, I was off to the races. And so I've only been in the research lab for 30 years, but I've been doing my research, I guess, for 40 years. And so now I work with students like you guys and I'm looking for the explanation about what was different about me that I went off the rails. And my girlfriend, who I drank with that night, turned out pretty normal. So what was wrong with me? And that's what the book is about, too. So I have 2 examples, if I have time, which I think I might, but I want to have plenty of time for questions. So I would start here with marijuana. And this is because, again, adolescence is the critical period. Most kids are using THC. Now, more of them initiate with a drink, but this is really a popular drug. So, and it's also really widespread. This map is outdated because I took it a month ago, but there are very few states left where some form of THC isn't legal, and in Florida, as you know, it is. So I want to explain the A process and the B process and the behavioral consequences. And this is both because it's relevant, maybe, and also it's personally relevant. So I drank that first day, but my favorite drug was marijuana. And I grew up in Florida, as I said, and it was in the 80s, so it used to wash up in bales. I guess it still does, I don't know. But it wasn't as potent, but it was really easy to get and with a little bit of intention. So I chain smoked. I loved to smoke marijuana. It made my boring middle-class life, I was kind of a brat, just tolerable if I could be completely stoned out of my mind. So that's how I went through everything. And I now understand why I liked it so much. So that's what I want to explain to you. So the marijuana plant has lots of chemicals. Cannabinoids are the chemicals in cannabis sativa, the cannabinoid plant. And THC is the famous one that gets us high, delta-9 THC, although there's also a delta-8 now that can do something too. But this is really what's responsible for my avid use. I just want to be totally clear, and I really try to keep up on this literature. As far as science knows, there are no medical benefits to THC, none. There are several risks. They are psychosis, if you're prone. Psychosis is the main, or one of the primary symptoms of schizophrenia. Some people who smoke develop schizophrenia. Some just have a psychotic episode and then can kind of back out. But this paper in The Lancet in 2019, that was a meta-analysis all over the world, argued pretty clearly and compellingly that 40% of the new cases of schizophrenia around the world are attributable to smoking high-potency weed. And schizophrenia, do I need to say, is an incredibly disabling disorder. So it can lead to psychosis. Probably not, but it could. It definitely impairs cognition. There was a recent paper, I don't think I have this in here, but I liked it because it was looking at, in sort of regular users like me who would be tolerant, it was looking at driving skills, and it had a simulator and all of that, and they were asked, I think, not to smoke for about 4 days before they came in. So who knows whether they did or not. But they came in and they got either a placebo, a low dose, or a high dose. And then they were asked to pretend to drive the car, and they were evaluated on that. And not only did they drive worse, these regular smokers, while they were intoxicated, but they thought they drove just fine. So it is impairing cognition, and it does definitely, it's correlated with depression. And that is kind of the ironic thing, because one of the reasons that medical marijuana is prescribed is to help you cope with depression when it actually exacerbates depression. So no medical benefit. Now, cannabidiol or CBD, which is also in the marijuana plant, does have medical benefits. Maybe, I just was reading something this morning again about the immune system, but for sure it benefits a certain rare type of childhood onset epilepsy. And I don't want to go on about that too long, but I think that one of the points is that when I was using in the 70s and 80s, these were about an equal measure. But because cannabidiol has no mind-altering properties, as far as we know, and it also is a natural B process to THC. So the more cannabidiol in the marijuana plant, the less high you get. Of course, the breeders have selectively bred, just like we make turkeys with big breasts, we make marijuana plants with low CBD, so that we can get more high and not less. So it's getting more potent and more dangerous. And there is a big problem. You know, I wasn't the only one who had a cannabis use disorder. About 20% of regular smokers do, especially if they begin early. And genetics plays a role. This positive reaction has an influence. Using weed to smoke with negative emotions is always, you know, for coping. And having disorders like ADHD. So there's a significant risk, maybe not in psychosis, and maybe the cognitive impairment isn't that important because you have plenty of reserve. Maybe you're resilient to depression, but the more, you know, but you don't want to develop a disorder, I wouldn't think. So to say why, so how does THC produce its effects? To just touch on that, I want to say that all drugs, including addictive drugs, produce their effects by changing the rate of what's already happening in the body. So all addictive drugs change the rate of what's happening in the brain. And for instance, we talked about how all addictive drugs increase the amount of dopamine in that mesolimbic news pathway or reward pathway. So they change the rate of what's already going on, and what is already going on with cannabinoids? This is a big question. It should be, I mean, why we didn't develop a capacity to respond to THC just for its own sake, probably. Not at all. The marijuana plant developed the capacity to manipulate us for its own sake. And it does so by mimicking two neurotransmitters called the anandamide and 2-arachidonylglycerol, or 2-AG. So these are the neurotransmitters that are in our brains that THC kind of pretends to be, imposes on. And these neurotransmitters are all over our brains. They are really widespread. They're in virtually every synapse. And I don't know how many neuroscience classes you've had, but our latest guess is something like 1,000 trillion synapses. So, you know, we would be going from here to Miami with zeros in that. 1,000 trillion synapses. So all of them have these chemicals, anandamide and 2-AG. It's all over the brain in areas to do with decisions and learning and value and movement and pretty much everything. And we all have these chemicals. I'm going to tell you how I think they're working, although it's still being kind of worked out. This is a very unique. Remember the dopamine pathways? There's a few cells here and there. The cannabinoid pathways are everywhere, literally. So it's the opposite pole. And an important paper was published not too long ago, so about almost a year ago. And I would direct you here if you want to question me, because this is a good summary. And it was published in Nature Neuroscience, which is a great journal, by one of the leaders in the field who was studying that she's trying to understand, or the group is trying to understand, what's wrong, or what are these cannabinoids doing? They're in every synapse. We know what dopamine's doing, movement and pleasure. What are these guys doing? So this is the abstract, and I almost took it out, but I just wanted to read for myself, I guess, one of the sentences, which is that by taking marijuana, we have unintended neurodevelopmental consequences because it's really popular with pregnant women, young mothers, and teens. So while the brains are developing today in the world, a lot of people are being exposed. And why should we care? Well, this is a paper from, this is a figure from their paper that's, I think, critical. They divided the developmental trajectory. So here's adulthood, here's adolescence between those, here's infancy and childhood, and here's the prenatal period. And this is kind of what's going on with the brain cells during those times. And then what you can see, you can't really see it, but along the y-axis, there's a bunch of little letters. And those are all either the cannabinoids themselves, their receptors, so anandamide and 2-AG, the receptors they interact with, the enzymes that make them. These are all cannabinoid-related signaling molecules. And the shape of those gray bars tells you what's changing. And just by staring at that, you can surely see that there's a lot of changes of cannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG signaling, during gestation and during adolescence. Massive reorganization of those pathways, suggesting that the anandamide and 2-AG are playing really critical roles in neurodevelopment. Look at the adults. It's basically like a runway, you know, not much happening. And I would argue then that the influence of THC is very different depending on the time. In older people, not that bad. I mean, it's not as toxic as alcohol. But in younger people, you're going to disrupt those pathways. So I have a picture of my puppy, who's not a puppy anymore. He's 5, so he's 100 pounds. But this really happened, and I thought it would be a good way to illustrate what's going on with those during adolescence. So this was his little adolescence, and he was out walking in the yard one day, and my daughter, who was maybe 12 or 13, dropped a piece of bacon in the grass. And this isn't bacon if you're noticing it, it's DNA, because that's my bacon. And I don't know what your bacon is, but for Bowden, it was actual bacon. Fell out of the sky one day. He came unglued, obviously, and ate the bacon. And I would argue that his brain, especially areas associated with taste and smell and probably the color of the sky and who was in the area, this was a salient, right? What could be more important than bacon? And so in certain areas, to kind of mark that event, he released those little shock signals. Are supposed to be like anandamide release, to kind of say, wow, you know, this is not kibble. This is something else. And we do the same thing. I don't know what your bacon is, maybe a line of poetry or a really great lecture or, you know, a first kiss or something. But we have anandamide and 2-AG in all of our synapses because who knows what's going to be important? who knows what's going to really need to be marked? And I don't have time to really go into it, but the signaling pathways for these chemicals are sort of unique in the nervous system. They're not like traditional neurotransmitters. They go from the, so normally a neuron releases a neurochemical onto another neuron. But in this case, the other neuron releases anandamide and 2-AG onto the first neuron. So it's kind of a way to reverberate or emphasize a signal. And so I would say that endocannabinoids like 2-AG and anandamide modulate virtually all brain activity to tell us what's important. And they act like a neurological highlighter to say, wow, bacon, or whatever it is. And that helps us sort information. Because really what we're trying to do to survive is to figure out what matters. What do I care about? What's just nothing? Do I not care about? And the nervous system is designed for that. So when something important happens, we would release anandamide like that. Now, I don't know how your friends smoke, but I know how I did. And it wasn't like that, those little tiny things, right? We take a bong hit or something, or a dab, and the next thing you know, everything is bacon, right? Because this is a chemical signal that can turn everything up. It's all important. And when I liked alcohol, but when I first smoked, I thought, holy smokes, I'm hilarious. She's hilarious. The music is amazing. The texture of the floor, holy smoke, rice-a-roni, I remember thinking, it was at the same friend's house, actually, the one who turned out perfectly fine. We had the munchies and made rice-a-roni, and I thought, how do they keep this stuff on the shelves? So good. I wouldn't eat it for anything now, but, that's what it does. It makes everything seem really rich and meaningful. And I thought, this is why it's so fun. By the way, this is why some people get paranoid, because if you have a tendency toward worry, it can accentuate that too. But that wasn't my problem. So I thought it was great. And it does cause pleasure by releasing dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway and helps us relax, some of us not. It makes stimuli rich and more meaningful. These are acute effects. For that reason, it impairs memory and driving, because if everything is relevant, it's hard to know, what to really pay attention to, and that slows our reaction time and can cause problems in critical tracking. But, you're also impaired with alcohol, and, that's a problem. But I don't think these are so devastating. This is not what I'm here to say, avoid this, because again, it's not the worst drug for your brain or for your behavior acutely. But with chronic use, and there are now probably hundreds of papers that show this. I'm just going to show you a little. These are rat brain slices, and so excuse me, but the rats were exposed in these studies to 6 injections of THC. 3 days or 6 days in a row. And then on the 6th day or the 7th day, the animals were sacrificed, and they took their brains and looked for the places where THC was having its effect. And you can see that the animals on the left who got a placebo, a vehicle, they never got the THC, they have a lot of dark spots. Those dark spots are all the synapses that THC acts in. I told you that it was all over the brain. There it is, all over the brain, in areas to do with learning and memory and motivation and thinking and movement. And then after 6 days, you can see that the brain slices on the right are much lighter. And if you give more than 6 days, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And if you had taken my brain by the time I got to treatment, it was probably white, because I smoked so much that the receptors went away. the places where THC could act went away. So remember the B process, aiming to keep things not all really, really interesting, because then how would I know if something important happened? So what my brain did is it downregulates. It gets rid of the receptors that interact with that, which meant that by the time I got to treatment, I could not face a day without being really high, because otherwise it was so bleak, so absolutely pointless. Nothing impressed me. You know, my grandfather's funeral, you know, oh my gosh, work, I better be high. Because I was operating with a downregulated system for what matters. So really nothing mattered except the bong, you know. And that was unfortunate because my brain was still developing. So here is just one example of what happens. The receptors go away in humans too, and I'm going to show you that picture in a minute. But when that happens while your brain is being organized, which is before you're about 25 years old, it changes the structure. So let's walk through this together a little bit. You're 16. You're supposed to be forming your identity. You're supposed to be figuring out, what do I love, what do I hate? You do that the hard, old-fashioned way until you find weed and you think, I'm kind of going to step back from that. I'm just going to watch cartoons and, you know, it's all great. And as a result, those receptors go away, and then I don't really, my brain doesn't care about stuff, and that changes the cortex. It changes the organization of the brain. So this is where the receptors go away, and that is how it alters the structure. And these are not, I like the quantitative rat brains better than the MRI scans, but these are human brains. And what we know is that the people who smoke the longest and the earliest in development have the most changes. The receptors recover, those on the right, they'll recover when you quit. So I remember I was clean for maybe 4 months. I was walking down the street one day, you know, just dragging myself through treatment and a halfway house and all that. And it was fall in Minnesota, and I went from South Florida to Minnesota. So you can imagine the leaves on the trees were unbelievable. And I hadn't really seen color, not only because I was in South Florida, but because I was kind of numb to gorgeousness. And the leaves were every color in the rainbow. And it was about 4 months in. I also started to appreciate other things again. So the receptors come back, but the altered, cortical structure really doesn't. Sorry about that. So those kind of stay that way. And my husband will say to me often, you know, isn't this good enough? You know, can't you ever be satisfied? I'm always like, I want to buy another plane ticket or redo a room or dig up the yard or something. You know, I'm discontent a little bit. And I think that is because the pathways that would convey a sense of value are insensitive, like the ears get deaf from too loud of music. So as a result, people like me and also in rats, there are fewer of those receptors, meaning your sensitivity to what matters is downregulated. I think not the end of the world if you're 60, but if you're 16, I think maybe devastating. This means you experience pleasure less well. Using early makes it probably permanent. This leads to, later on, an enhanced tendency to take other drugs, well documented. Marijuana is a gateway drug. Every drug is a gateway drug. Because by becoming insensitive, you then have to take more. And you like it more because it alleviates the lack of pleasure. Okay. I already said that one. I said you can take this picture. They're more impulsive. They're more depressed. less likely to graduate from high school, and have a risk of psychosis. They're also more likely to attempt suicide as a result of that. So what I'm saying is that marijuana is not only not medicinal, it's not innocuous, especially during adolescence. And now, oh my gosh, I'm really getting out of time, but I just want to do really quick, and then I won't do the other part. So I said that it was more prevalent in prenatal during gestation too. There's a big rise in this. In COVID, this is a pretty recent paper from last fall. There's about a 25% increase in mothers smoking before giving birth. And there's a great study, an amazing initiative at the NIH to study all kinds of things, but longitudinally. So they started prenatally, and they're going through adolescence and into adulthood. And some of the people there are people, and they get all kinds of information, genetics and early exposure to drugs and broccoli and everything else. So anyway, these are data coming out from that. And there's, you probably can't read all the small print, but these are 6 tendencies, which we'll go through quickly, and 3 groups. One that were never exposed to THC prenatally, ones that were exposed, and when the mother and father figured out they were pregnant, they stopped smoking, and ones that were exposed and kept going because it helps with morning sickness or whatever, which is actually pretty popular. And what you can see is that psychotic-like symptoms, by the way, this is in 4 and 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds. So, you know, afraid of the monsters under the bed, worse. Internalizing symptoms, depression, anxiety. Externalizing symptoms, getting in trouble. Attention problems, thought problems, so not doing well in school, and social problems, all increase. Now, there's other things maybe going on, but this does not look good. So even though it's legal, I would say the bottom line here, as I wrap it up, is that the brain compensates for any drug that alters its activity by producing the opposite effect. And especially when used during adolescence, all drugs, but marijuana is the example here, decreases sensitivity to reward and pleasure. And we should use this information to guide what we do. I had so I said I raised 3 teenagers. One of them worked on a farm in Vermont one summer, and he came home and his car reeked. And he said, but it's legal in Vermont. I was like, Trey, where's your science skills? You know, don't use that, use evidence. So I do think there's likely to be lasting impacts. And in fact, one last piece of bad news is that the offspring and their offspring, so the children and the grandchildren that weren't not conceived at the time that the adolescents were using, show increased anxiety, 1 or 2 generations, increased risk of taking other drugs, more depression, and changes in their offspring and the grandkids. So this is a whole new area of research. Basically, I want to say that addiction occurs as a result of the brain changing and adapting to maintain homeostasis, and that it will adapt to go back. The earlier you can give it a chance to do that, the better, because everything is learned better when you're young. We should be maybe worried about the multi-generational effects that I think are concerning scientists today. So any drug that we take regularly to change our feelings are going to lead to the opposite state, and that causes tolerance, dependence, and craving, which is addiction.